Ego tends to get a very bad reputation these days, especially in that kind of pop psychology, pseudo-spirituality kind of intersection. And this can send people down a confusing path, at least to some extent or another. This idea that eradicating one's ego is a noble cause and or endeavor and or essential for like some degree of enlightenment. Now, I don't want to undermine the many benefits that can come from what's known as an ego death, but my God, is it harrowing? And as it turns out, there might be a little bit more to it than that. What is the ego? Well, by most definitions and or applications of the term these days, it comes off as if it's something arbitrary, some misguided fool that just needs to prop itself up and feed off of adulation. Well, this is actually what happens when one has a very weak ego. The ego essentially is more like a cellular membrane. I mean, I guess probably a better question is, what is the self? What is self actually? That's like an environment, an ecosystem. It's not any one thing. It's a fucking orchestra. You've got so many different players in that orchestra as well. You've got your instincts. You've got complexes. You've got relating functions. With all the dodgy roadmaps out there that seem to be more distracting and destructive to any psychobiological process or psychobiologically complementary process of self-actualization, it's no wonder that the tune that the orchestra is playing gets all discordant. I'm going to link a video in the comments section. This is a video from the folks at Young to Live By, that's Jung, as in Carl Jung, talking about the importance of an ego strength, especially when going into the unconscious, for example. In my experience, there's no one size fits all, and I've had to find a lot of different kinds of parts and pieces from any number of modalities that help actualize my own genomic expression. In order to do that, I've had to see what works and what doesn't. Sacred cows out there I'm not attempting to offend. For example, I'm a big fan of the model and approaches that the Young to Live By folks do. I just think it's, well, there's some tweaks I'd make personally, but that's the thing, that's just for me. But also some tweaks to make it more approachable. Because there's so many parts of the kind of Jungian outlook, which it's almost as if you just know them in a certain way, that in and of itself can be so resonant, it acts as like kind of an activating point for one's inner blueprints, their internal roadmaps. And all they need is the right kind of blueprints and roadmaps to see, to reflect back and forth. that in and of itself can go a long way. Because you can get really heady with the young to live by stuff. And now that's important as a study and mapping a lot of this stuff out. But for the average person or someone who's not particularly interested in that sort of thing, is just struggling with any number of things, well, that's not going to cut it. But the problem is it's not a lot of practitioners of this sort of thing, as there's not exactly a lot of practitioners of any number of highly effective modalities when it comes to the whole healing journey thing and so on. So another big one in my experience and opinion is having a very trauma-informed approach. Because, what do you know? Strangely enough, it seems this whole developmental trauma thing is kind of the norm in many respects. Sure, there are some pockets, some Shangri-Las out there where the developmental process is mostly good and good enough for the right kind of psychological or psychobiological development to take shape, and homogeneity within one's community, individually, interpersonally, all that. But in others it is not. And in place of that forms this bizarre Faustian bargain of this toxic homeostasis. That's what the psyche is always attempting to do, achieve a form of homeostasis. And it'll do the best it can with what it's got. But at the same time, in my experience, it's always trying to talk to you, trying to communicate something. This is what I like to call the languages of the unconscious, and we'll do so symbolically, or in stories, or in patterns that keep happening. Because the unconscious is a symbolic storyteller. It's one of the ways it tries to talk to you, in a sense. It can be like an immune system as well. Might have some uncanny valley type effects if something's gone awry. And you can't quite put your finger on it, but your intuition has got a pretty good idea of what's going on. Enough to know that something's up. So it looks through what it's got in the archives. What kind of things can I show this person to get their attention? It's frightening imagery. Usually it tends to be along similar lines for people experiencing similar things. There's profound intelligence in there. Yeah, when it comes to this whole ego thing, and the self being like an ecosystem, and my God, can it be a diverse ecosystem when you really get in there. There's any number of things that need to be kind of done to clean up that ecosystem. For one, one's instincts can be all fucked up. And those need to be, you gotta hold like a committee meeting and talk to them. And get some habilitation and or rehabilitation going with those instincts, clearing the crap out of the way, the blocks, which is usually any number of blocks in the way. And then complexes can be so misleading. Complexes can seem like a viable intuitive nudge or pull, for example, or something archetypal. But very misleading and misguiding. Now, it will typically have, in my experience, some kind of air of legitimacy in there. Or else it wouldn't get much of a pull if it was all bullshit. But it's all the corrupted files, I suppose, that tend to make it more murky. But yeah, all this stuff can be done. The problem is, I don't really know of any comprehensive approach that I could really lay out there. I know parts and pieces. And as there is no one size fits all, and considering how much we've part of that kind of healing process is getting in tune with oneself and what your boundaries are and everything like this. Like, boundaries are not something arbitrary. For anybody who doesn't have boundaries, it might... I didn't even understand what boundaries meant to begin with. Thought it was like drawing some kind of hard line, but it's not. It's more becoming aware of what you can handle to what extent. And your boundary is like this it's not a hard line. It's more like a bunch of soft materials built over and over and over to the point where it becomes a membrane. It's not rigid, but it is a protective layer in that ecosystem. And we're kind of like, some parts are kind of like the forest wardens, if you will. And the ego is part of that membrane and so many other things. It's a regulating function, an ambassador from that ecosystem to the outer ecosystem, which is kind of one and the same at some points, but individualized as well. I have a feeling that if I can figure out how to articulate this stuff better, it could be helpful. But it's a bit of a challenge, so I'm working on it. And it might take time. But in the meantime, trial and error, and or anything in between. So I figured I'd just start saying what I'm familiar with, because I'm sorry to say, but some innovation is needed, big time. We've all got to be like explorers, in a sense. At the same time, I do know of people who've come back from insurmountable odds, the impossible. And they're doing quite well. And funny enough, we all seem to have a similar kind of outlook and understanding. I would say it's because it's in alignment with underlying psychobiology, following that mandate, but also cleaning and clearing it up. There's an intelligence to so many things. And yeah, there's any number of corruptions in there, but that stuff can be disentangled from identifying it, seeing what you're getting out of it, seeing if there's an addiction to it. This is another thing. Ideally, it's like finding that which can help enable these processes to happen more spontaneously, as opposed to, any kind of approach that's too fixed and or rigid or just counterproductive. An approach that is not resonant. So, as opposed to that, that which can help enable more spontaneous healing effects, because fucking A. Now, sometimes it is going to be more laborious, that's just how it is, but I really don't want to overlook that extra intelligence and what it can do. Charting those environments of the great unknown, in so many respects, even though they've been charted, there's still so much. There's so many things we don't know about, or don't know nearly enough about. Charting that frontier of within. And for those who can, I understand that some people out there, their experience of within is quite empty, and fuck it. Here's a tip just in case. Just in case anybody like that is ever listening, finds himself in this video. If you're interested, there's something that you could potentially do about that. As I understand it, that emptiness is derived from a lack of nutritional fulfillment, in a sense, for vital aspects of your inner being. So as a survival mechanism, you disconnected and disassociated from that and built more of a construct However, you just might be able to get in touch with some threads that exist within that emptiness, such as feelings of grief within there. Grief for that lost sense of self that never got to develop. It's almost like in tuning in with that, you can begin to enable the process of like the neurons of that part of self to begin putting themselves together. Now, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, as far as I understand it, it's not usually the best of threads to start with. But grieving is very important in the whole healing process and learning how to do so. If anybody would ever like anything a little bit more detailed about that, do let me know. I happen to know of a resource or two. I can leave a link. Yeah, I don't know. There's a fair amount of issues out there that can be attended to. A lot of things that a lot of folks just seem to get in this mentality, oh, it is what it is, and it can't be, can't do a damn thing about it. I understand this is, in many circles, this is almost like a given. But as it turns out, it doesn't need to be that way. I'm not talking about things that sound good on paper, but don't work so well in practice. Quite the opposite. It almost feels dangerous for me to discuss at the same time, like it's got to be protected. I can't say too much at any given time. I'm on my own healing journey, you see, so. Learning just as much as anybody else at any given time. Comparing notes. So this is what I got. What do you got? My experience, there is this phenomenal intelligence to things, but it's kind of different than how it's been described. I think that's important to note because ideally it'd be better if more people could learn how to perceive that for themselves or uncover those perceptions within them that are always going at any given time. They're just all clogged and misappropriated. Could save a lot of time. Bobbing and weaving, dodging bullets, left and right. So what is the ego? Something else entirely than it's been presented as. The more that one can understand and experience that, the better, because there's an intelligence there too. And one of the many ironies, just like anything else that is repressed, it tends to regress. If one tries to will the ego away or is in this constant battle, which will tend to happen just by suggestion, that the ego is just this thing that has to be quarreled with and or overcome. Wahaha. It's going to create a discord, because this is a discordant roadmap, in my opinion. It is not concurrent with underlying psychobiology. Therefore, it is not concurrent with actualizing one's genomic expression. And that which is repressed regresses. It's kind of funny. It's usually a very janky egoic endeavor to try to rid oneself of their ego, Or a desperate measure. There's that too, because of all the pain and suffering and misery. Well, back to that orchestra thing. It's any number of components. The trauma thing seems to be a big one to me. I think that's probably foundational, one of the most important ones, the developmental trauma thing. This has to be worth looking into. Check out anything from Daniel Mackler. He's on YouTube. He's one of the best people I know who talks about this stuff. I don't think I found a single video of his which hasn't been uniquely healing in and of itself. I'd call that resonant information. But you've also got this phenomenal, kind of more mystical side of things. And that's just... Not many seem to say it openly, but it's like that's just a part of psychobiology. This phenomenal kind of intelligence, the quantum supercomputer, the unconscious, then the collective unconscious, another quantum supercomputer, with interactive components and interfaces that we kind of need to have in order to actualize, and some, and maybe even more. Who's to say what's on the other side of that looking glass? Phenomenal stuff. Yeah. Something like that. I think that's it for this one. Thanks for tuning in.